Hey, RezaieStrong follower, Salim Rezaie here, and I had to make this video because I had several people send this out to me. Should we stop intermittent fasting? And the American Heart Association just put out a press release on March 18th of 2024, and this was the headline: 8-hour time-restricted eating linked to a 91% higher risk of cardiovascular death. And so everybody was asking me, what are my thoughts on this? And so I wanted to make a video basically going over that. So basically what they did in this presentation is they followed about 20,000 American adults. And what they did is they used this thing called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Surveys, which is basically a survey people fill out about their kind of dietary plans and what they do in terms of what they're eating. Then they looked at another database of people who died in the US from the CDC National Health Index, and they looked at it over a period of 8 years. And then what they did is they had these pre-specified eating windows. So people who are eating 16 hours a day, 12 to 16 hours a day, 10 to less than 12 hours a day, 8 to less than 10 hours a day, and then less than 8 hours a day. And that less than 8 hours a day is essentially intermittent fasting. And they were comparing that to the 12 to 16 hour window, which is what they considered to be baseline for most people. And then what they did is they started looking for associations. So people fill out a survey. We see the time that people die. We kind of compare those two. Here's some eating windows, and let's see if we can find some needles in the haystack. This is the actual abstract. I had to go online and find it, but this was the actual thing that was presented. And what I want to focus in on is what they basically said is the statistically significant outcome, which was increased cardiovascular mortality or death. Now, I've highlighted 3 things here because that was the headline. And they followed 20,000 people, but for the overall sample of cardiovascular death, there was only 414 people in that arm with 31 events. For people who had cardiovascular disease, there was 17 events out of 45 people. And for people who had a history of cancer, there was 5 events out of 30 people. So out of 20,000 people, we're talking about 414 people, 45 people, and 30 people. Very, very small sample size. And so we have to be really careful with that in terms of drawing robust conclusions. So back to the original question, should we stop intermittent fasting? You can't believe everything you read online. I don't know how many times I have to say this. I don't know how many times this is said, but we have to use our heads. How many things in life are linked to a 91% increase in anything? So at face value, that headline already makes no sense. But for those people who are naysayers, this study should have never gotten a press release. I understand why people do this. They like to generate these clickbait headlines so that things can go crazy. But there is very limited information on this abstract. And I'm going to give you 5 reasons why you should question this headline, even if you don't believe it at face value, which I don't. So reason number 1, abstracts are considered preliminary until full data is published. And there's a good reason for that because we have the results, but we don't know the complete methods. And there are some huge issues with methodology when we're talking about studies like this that are looking at population level epidemiologic sorts of things. And you can't draw robust conclusions. And I think the authors are overstepping here. And the journalists are just putting out headlines to get people to come and read and to freak out. So that's number 1, is that this is just preliminary data, right? This isn't the full publication that's gone through a peer review process that has looked at all this stuff, biostatisticians, etc., all these PhDs after their names and letters after their names telling us that these are robust conclusions. Reason number 2, this is an observational study, right? So they look at these 2 sorts of things, and then they put people into these categories and they looked for observations, right? It wasn't like they compared one thing to another thing, which is called a randomized clinical trial. And so all observational trials can do is give us associations, right? Less than 8 hours of eating is associated with increased cardiovascular death. That is a hypothesis generating type of conclusion. They are not saying, and the authors were very clear about this, that they're actually saying that there is causation between the two. So something being associated is not the same thing as something causing. So that's reason number 2. Reason number 3, and this is the problem when you have just abstracts, is that there may be other factors that were not considered. And these are what we call confounders. So for example, what were people's blood pressures in all these different windows? What were their cholesterol profiles? What types of food were eaten? How sedentary were they? Were these all equal across all the different groups? And we don't have that kind of granular detail. Baseline differences between groups, right? So like if I'm comparing things and I'm looking for an observation, we need to know that the groups were equal at baseline before we start saying that this is actually because of the less than 8 hours of eating. So for example, maybe people who are doing the less than 8 hours of eating work a lot of night shifts compared to the people that don't. Well, we know that night shifts are associated with increased stress, increased risk of stroke, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of cancers. And so we would need to know that. Smoking habits. Maybe the people that were doing this were doing it because they were unhealthy. They had been smoking a lot and their doctors recommended that they start working out and being kind of more careful with their diet. If people in the less than 8 hour group are more stressed and smoking 2 packs a day versus the people in the other groups who are not as stressed and only smoking maybe 1 or 2 cigarettes a day, well, that's going to bias the results to say that less than 8 hours of eating is going to cause increased cardiovascular mortality. And then we don't know what the level of physical activity was here. We don't know if these people are sedentary, if they're more active. And so again, if the people in the less than 8 hour window are more sedentary than the people in the other observed windows, then that's going to bias the results to saying that the less than 8 hours of eating is going to increase cardiovascular mortality. And this is my biggest problem with this study, is that they based their entirety of their results on 2 random 24-hour dietary recall questionnaires. So in the first year that people were included in this study, they were picked on 2 random days to fill out a questionnaire and to say what type of eating they were doing. Less than 8 hours, the 8 to 10 hours, 8 to 12 hours, 12 to 16, or greater than 16. Now, the problem with this is that what I tell you on a Monday may not even be true on a Friday. And so how do we know that these 2 random days that people were surveyed was actually what they were doing over the entirety of 8 years, which is what they were followed for? There is no guarantees that what people put on this survey is what they were actually doing, which completely blows up the results of this entire study. The bottom line for me, guys, instead of freaking out about a headline, what's more likely to be true is that what you eat and your overall lifestyle, whether you're sedentary or active, is way more important than if you ate all your food in less than 8 hours that determines cardiovascular mortality. So there you go. This is why I don't believe this headline. I appreciate people who sent it to me, but I find this really hard to believe, and we'll see when the full study comes out. But in the meantime, I'm going to continue with my intermittent fasting until I see better evidence that says that there is actual harm. Let me know your thoughts, comments, and questions. Thank you for sending this my way, and until next time.